Time now for Focus. Today we're heading to Lebanon, which has gone a year without a president. More than 20 parliamentary sessions have been held to address the issue, to no avail. But many politicians say Lebanon might actually be better off without a president, particularly because of what's going on in Syria and Iraq. Sofia, Amara and Maronite Pradel explain.
It was exactly 1 year ago that the President of the Republic of Lebanon, Michel Sleiman, returned home at the end of his 6-year term. Since then, no one has taken his place, and the country of cedars has been without a president. In Lebanon, the head of state is elected by parliament. Place d'Étoile in downtown Beirut, where the assembly sits. Marwan Hamadeh is a member of the March 14 alliance, which fiercely opposes the Syrian regime.
Here are the seats of the 128 deputies, the number of MPs in the Lebanese parliament, the benches of the government. The president of the chamber, the President Barry, is up there. Well, he's supposed to be up there. I'm on his right. I'm the Secretary General of the Assembly. And as you can see, nobody. There has been no one for more than a year. We gathered with our results 23 times in this chamber. We have never been more than 60 MPs. Our colleagues never came. They did not allow us to form a quorum. Much like at the time of the Third Republic in France, which we were inspired by, the Constitution compels this chamber to sit continuously to elect a president. This is because of the stubbornness of one candidate who says it's me or no one and who prevents his allies and his bloc from coming to parliament.
This candidate is General Michel Aoun, a Christian pillar of the March 8 camp, which is dominated by the pro-Syrian government Hezbollah party. He declined to be interviewed. One of his deputies, Nabil Nicolas, agreed to explain his position. For the Aounist movement, the priority is not to elect a head of state.
Currently, we cannot elect a president because the Lebanese MPs no longer have the people's legitimacy. Twice our mandate was renewed. That is why, today, the General has made several proposals. Either a referendum or direct elections by the people. And he has said that there is only one constitutional way. That is to go for new legislative elections and after elect a president.
A referendum, a nationwide poll, new parliamentary elections, everything except cope with the current parliamentary majority, which is favourable to March 14, the sovereigntist camp which supports the other Christian candidate, Samir Jarjah. In his stronghold at Marab, Kassawan, he wants to show us the cell, rebuilt exactly as it was, in which he spent 11 years while Lebanon was still under Syrian occupation. Since his release in 2005, he has been one of the fiercest opponents of the regime in Damascus.
I sometimes spend entire days like this.
What is that?
It's a balango. They hung prisoners with it. I spent 11 years in this environment under the Syrian regime.
Jarjah and March 14 denounced the harmful influence of Damascus on Lebanese politics. For them, this blockage is the result of Hezbollah's fears of having a new president who opposes the Party of God's military engagement in Syria.
There are regional and local forces that prevent this presidential election from being held.
Which ones?
Regionally, there is obviously Iran, and locally, Hezbollah and its allies.
Hezbollah and its allies accuse Samir Jarjah and the March 14 alliance of being subservient to America and Saudi Arabia, something he totally rejects.
To facilitate the holding of these elections, I even offered to retire from the race if the other party agreed to come to parliament to vote for a consensus candidate.
It is a total deadlock, and on the street, the Lebanese are split between concern and indifference.
I think this is a disaster. I fear that it is leading us to an absolute constitutional vacuum.
What can we do? If there's a president available in France, send him to us.
It's always been like this, and we always emerge as if nothing had happened. That's Lebanon and Lebanese for you.
While deploring the presidential vacuum, the outgoing president, Michel Sleiman, welcomes Lebanon's unusual example in a region in crisis.
Lebanon has offered up a fine example of democracy with my departure from the presidency at the end of my mandate. Despite this gap, despite the assassinations, the situation in Syria, Daesh, the Islamic State group, Lebanon has survived. And it has proven more stable than ever, as if the Lebanese become stronger when they face great dangers.
Batten down the hatches until the storm passes. For now, this is the attitude of the Lebanese, whose upcoming president will have to face many challenges.
For more on this, I'm now joined in the studio by Ziad Majed, who teaches Middle East Studies at the American University of Paris. Hello, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Now, first of all, we just heard there at the end of that report, obviously the political landscape in Lebanon is incredibly complicated. The president the outgoing president, former president, says that still Lebanon is at least stable at the moment, even though the country hasn't had a president for a year. Is it better off without one?
No, I don't think it's better off without one, but at the same time, it's important to avoid confrontations. Now, since the Lebanese are divided, they cannot have a quorum in the parliament. Their representatives, some of them are boycotting the sessions, not to allow the other camp to win a possible election. So we do have two candidates, each representing one alliance. The March 8 alliance that is led by Hezbollah and is pro-Syrian regime and pro-Iranian has its candidate Michel Aoun. The March 14 that is opposed to the Syrian regime has its candidate Samir Jaja. With those two heavyweights when it comes to the representation of Lebanese Christians, the compromise is difficult, and that's why each camp would avoid a possible defeat in elections, and they prefer to postpone. But it's not the first time that Lebanon has a crisis like this. In 1995, the Constitution was amended in order to make an election possible. In 1998, once again, the Constitution was amended in order to allow for the chief of the army to be elected. 2004, there was a crisis. 2007, a crisis. And now it's been a year without a president. It's also showing that the Lebanese political system, based on consensus, based on what is called consociational democracy, maybe has reached some of its limits. It cannot manage crisis anymore. So everyone prefer to delay dealing with the crisis in order to avoid worsening the situation, especially with what's happening in Syria and in the whole region.
But like you say, it's not the first time that the Lebanese people have had to wait a very long time before they get a new president. And I understand that the last time it ended in street battles, and that was how the solution came about. Might that happen now?
I don't think it will happen now for different reasons. From one side, in 2008, it was not yet the current situation in Syria. Damascus was still strong. The Assad regime was still strong and influential in Lebanon. And it orchestrated those street battles in order to make a kind of forcing or in order to impose a certain solution. It did not succeed 100%, but there was a compromise in Doha later that allowed for a new president to be elected, a national coalition government to be formed. This time, Assad is extremely weak. Now it's Hezbollah that is managing the Lebanese scene. It's sending even fighters to save Assad in Syria, and its alliance with Iran is decisive. On the other side, I think Saudi Arabia tries to avoid opening a new front against the Iranians in Lebanon. So Iran and Saudi Arabia are already engaged in confrontations by proxy in Syria and Iraq and now in Yemen. So maybe they prefer to keep Lebanon for the time being stable when it comes to its security situation. And if the absence of a president does not lead to street confrontations, then let's wait and try to find another compromise, knowing that we don't have also a parliament, because the current parliament, even if it continues to meet and to maybe vote on some law suggestion from the government, but its mandate ended more than a year ago, so they did not reach an agreement on what electoral law to adopt, and that's why there was no parliamentary elections. So there is a problem in the institutions, and of course, the division when it comes to what's happening in Syria is taking confessional lines, which is making the situation much more difficult. Maybe, I don't know if the people know that the president should be Christian Maronite, the chief of the parliament Muslim Shia, and the prime minister Muslim Sunnah. This is the way the quota plus 50-50 in the parliament between Christians and Muslim and in the government. So the system tries to represent the elites of all communities, but also when those elites do not agree on an agenda, it leads to tension and confrontations.
You touched on the consequences of there not being a president, and one of them obviously is that major issues aren't being dealt with, like, for example, the refugee crisis.
Absolutely.
So what's being done about that? Do they have to wait perhaps till the end of the war in Syria before there's a new president and these issues are resolved?
Probably they have to wait for a Syrian solution. Today, the government of Lebanon decided, in fact, even under President Sulaiman, who appeared on your report, decided to be neutral when it comes to the situation in Syria. However, Hezbollah, that participates in the Lebanese government and the parliament, did not respect that neutrality and sent thousands of fighters to Syria. Their presence in Syria contributed also to the refugee crisis, because most of the refugees in Lebanon are from the Kalamoun and Homs areas where Hezbollah is involved in battles, and we have about 1 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. So this adds to the problems in the country. They live in very difficult conditions. They do have economic, humanitarian, all kinds of crises. They are sometimes confronted with some Lebanese racism, but also there is lots of solidarity with them. However, they are going to stay in Lebanon until there is a solution in Syria. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, with the absence of a president, with a parliament incapable of deciding on its own, in fact, on electoral law, allowing for new elections, with the government divided at the same time, and with the whole chaos in the region, the only hope is that the Lebanese civil society, with its dynamism, and it's there, it's active, it's trying to continue producing in terms of culture, arts, the Lebanese memory of the civil war, and the fact that most of the Lebanese do not want to see violence returning to their country. I think this is the only hope, while the political crisis, in my opinion, will continue until a solution in Syria.
Okay, I'm afraid we have to leave it there. Really appreciate your time, Ziad Mojdeh. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.